Being buried alive is one of the most dreadful phobias. Edgar Allan Poe wrote about it, and it has been the subject of numerous horror films. Surprisingly, real-life examples of this horrible mistake are more common than one might expect. This list contains 10 such cases. Oh, and by the way, number 1 is truly disturbing. At number 10, the story of Virginia McDonald. Virginia McDonald resided in New York City with her father before becoming ill, dying, and being buried in Brooklyn's Greenwood Cemetery. Following the funeral, her mother proclaimed her belief that her daughter had not died when she was buried, and she continued to believe so. The family tried unsuccessfully to reassure the mother of her daughter's death. Finally, the mother insisted so strongly that her daughter was buried alive that the family agreed to have the body hauled up. To their astonishment, they discovered the body lying on its side with badly bitten hands and all signs of a premature burial. Number 9. Madame Blunden. When Madame Blunden was presumed dead, she was interred in the Blunden family crypt at Holy Ghost Chapel in Basingstoke, England. The vault was located beneath a boys' school. The day following the funeral, while playing, some boys heard a disturbance from the vault below. After one of the boys went and informed his instructor of the noises, the sexton was summoned. The vault and casket were opened barely in time to see her last breath. All feasible measures were taken to resuscitate her, but they were ineffective. In her anguish, she ripped wildly at her cheeks and chewed the nails off her fingers. Number 8. A girl named Collins. A girl named Collins died unexpectedly here recently. Sometime later, the body was unearthed before being moved to another burial site, and it was discovered that the girl had been buried alive. Her shroud was torn into shreds, her legs were dragged up to her chin. One of her arms was twisted under her head, and her features showed indications of horrific torture. Number 7. The gendarme. A gendarme was buried alive in a town near Grenoble. The man had become intoxicated with potato brandy and fell into a deep sleep. After 20 hours of sleep, his friends assumed he had died, especially since his body had assumed the rigidity of a corpse. When the sexton was lowering the remains of the ill-fated gendarme into the grave, he heard moans and knocks coming from the inside of the 4 boards. He promptly made holes in the sides of the coffin to allow air in, then knocked off the lid. However, the gendarme had died after horrifically mutilating his skull in his frenzied but hopeless attempts to open his casket. Number 6. Tonins. A heinous case of premature internment occurred not long ago at Tonins, in the lower Garonne. The victim, a man in his prime, had only a few shovelfuls of earth dumped into his grave when an unclear noise was heard coming from his casket. The gravedigger, horrified beyond description, rushed to seek aid, and it was some time before he returned when the throng, which had gathered in large numbers around the grave, insisted on the casket being opened. Once the initial boards were removed, it was clear that the individual had been buried alive. His countenance was frightfully constricted from the agony he had endured, and in his struggles, the poor guy had wrenched his arms entirely out of the winding sheet in which they had been firmly wrapped. A physician who was on the scene opened a vein, but no blood flowed. The victim was beyond the scope of art. If you made it to this point, drop a comment and say, "Made it." Number 5. The doctor and the mayor. According to the evidence, a woman was interred with all the customary formalities some time ago, and it was assumed that she was dead, despite the fact that she was actually in a trance. Some days later, when the grave in which she had been deposited was opened to receive another body, it was discovered that the unhappy woman's garments had been torn to bits, and she had even broken her limbs in an attempt to extract herself from the living tomb. After hearing the evidence, the court condemned the doctor who signed the death certificate and the mayor who permitted the internment to 3 months in prison for involuntary manslaughter. The circumstance of Miss Hockwalt's death. The news that Miss Hockwalt, a young girl with great social connections who was thought to have died unexpectedly, was buried alive has caused a stir here, and it has since become the talk of the city. The circumstance of Miss Hockwalt's death was peculiar. It took place on the morning of her brother's marriage to Miss Emma Schwind at Eminel's church. Shortly before 6 p.m., the young lady entered the kitchen to prepare for her wedding. A few moments later, she was discovered seated on a chair, with her head leaning against a wall, seemingly motionless. Medical assistance was sought, and Dr. Jewett, after an examination, declared her dead. Mass was being read at the time at Eminel's church, so it was decided to go forward with the wedding, which was held in the darkness. The test revealed that Anna had an irritable temperament, was neurotic, and suffered from sympathetic palpitation of the heart. Dr. Jewett believed this was the reason of her reported death. The following day, the lady was buried in the woodland. Miss Hockwalt's friends were unable to forget the horrible impression, and several ladies noticed that her eyes were remarkably natural in color, leading them to believe she was still alive. They expressed their opinion to Annie's parents, and the concept weighed heavily on them, prompting the body to be removed from the grave. It was claimed that when the casket was uncovered, the supposed inert body had turned on its right side. The hair was ripped off in handfuls, and the flesh was chewed off the fingers. The body was reinterred, and efforts were made to bury the facts, but some claim to have seen the body and know the details as related. Number 3. Mary Nora Best. Mrs. Moore-Chew's adopted daughter, Mary Nora Best, was 17 years old. Mary was declared dead from cholera and buried in the Chew's vault of an old French cemetery in Calcutta. The surgeon who declared her dead was a man who would have benefited from her death and had attempted to murder her adoptive mother. Before Mary died, her adoptive mother escaped to England following the second attempt on her life, leaving Mary behind. Mary was put in a pine casket and fastened shut. 10 years later, in 1881, the crypt was opened to reveal the body of Mrs. Moore while burying her brother. When the undertaker's assistant entered the crypt, the lid of Mary's coffin lay on the floor. Her skeleton was partly within and half outside the casket. After being entombed, Mary apparently awoke from her trance and battled frantically until she was able to force the lid off her coffin. It is believed that after cracking open her casket, she fell from the pressure and died when she banged her skull against the brick shelf. It is thought that the surgeon poisoned the girl and then declared her dead. Number 2. Jenkins. A gentleman from Flat Creek Township in this Buncombe County reports that a young man named Jenkins, who had been sick with fever for some weeks, was believed to have died. He became silent. His flesh became cold and clammy. He could not be awoken, and there appeared to be no activity in the pulse or heart. He was supposed to be dead and was being readied for burial, but there was no stiffness in any of his limbs. He was buried following his presumed death, and when he was placed in the coffin, it was noted that he was as limber as a living man. The case sparked significant discussion in the community, with many believing Jenkins had been buried alive. Nothing was done about it until later that month, when the coffin was removed and interred in the family burying place in Henderson County. Because the coffin was made of wood, it was proposed that it be opened to determine whether the body was in good enough condition to be transported 20 miles without being placed in a metallic casket. The casket was opened, and to the amazement and horror of his relatives, the body was laying face downward, with hair torn off the head in large quantities and fingernail marks on the inside of the lid and sides. These facts sparked tremendous interest, and everyone who were intimately acquainted with the facts believed Jenkins was in a trance, or that animation was seemingly suspended, and that he was not quite dead when buried, returning to consciousness only to discover himself buried and beyond rescue. The remains was then relocated to Henderson County and reburied. The relatives are devastated beyond words at what they call criminal irresponsibility and not being certain. Jenkins was dead before he was buried. Okay, here we are. Number 1, Madame Bobin. In 1901, a pregnant Madame Bobin came on a vessel from Western Africa and appeared to be suffering from yellow fever. She was subsequently taken to a hospital for patients with contagious disorders. There, she deteriorated, died, and was buried. A nurse later stated that she saw that the body was not cold and that the abdominal muscles were trembling, and that she suspected she had been buried prematurely. Madame Bobin's father ordered that the body be exhumed after learning of this. They were horrified to see that a baby had been born and died with Madame Bobin in the casket. An examination revealed that Madame Bobin died of asphyxiation in the casket rather than yellow fever. A lawsuit against the health officials resulted in £8,000, $13,000, in damages against them. So that's your 10. You might want to sleep with one eye open tonight.